The great hall smelled of roasted pumpkin and burned wax, and Harry was not hungry. He hadn't been hungry since they'd spotted the goblet of fire sitting at the front of the hall like an old man keeping his own counsel. All dark wood and banked authority, the blue-white flames inside it throwing cold light across every face at the feast. You could see your reflection in it if you were close enough. Harry had not wanted to be close enough. He sat between Ron and Hermione at the Gryffindor table. Ron was on his left, eating with the focused dedication of someone who had accepted the night was too large to hold, and had decided on the treacle tart instead. Hermione had a book open beside her plate, some wizarding lore text from the library. But she wasn't reading it. She was watching the goblet with the expression she reserved for sums that refused to balance. The hall was packed to its edges. Beauxbaton students sat in their pale blue silk, most of them slightly cold, the Scottish Highlands having made no accommodation for whatever heat charms they were used to running back home. The Durmstrang boys were heavier, darker, quieter. They watched everything with a careful, practiced attentiveness, as if attention itself was something you could train into a defensive posture. Victor Crumb sat at the far end of the Slytherin table, absorbed into Hogwarts by sheer gravity of fame, and Harry had watched Fred and George spend the entire first course trying not to stare at him. They had not succeeded. Dumbledore stood. The hall went still the way it always went still for Dumbledore, not commanded, not compelled, but shifted. Some change in pressure, and the chatter simply ceased. He darkened the hall with a word. The hundreds of floating candles guttered to nothing at once, and only the goblet remained lit, its pale, restless fire throwing shadows up across the enchanted ceiling, where a black November sky churned above them all. Harry found he had set down his fork without deciding to. The first flame came, a tongue of red-white fire, sudden, and a charred slip of parchment curled upward into Dumbledore's waiting hand. He unfolded it. His voice came clear and without urgency. The champion for Durmstrang, Victor Crumb. The roar from the Slytherin table was immediate. Crumb rose slowly, the way someone does when applause stopped surprising them long ago, and walked toward the side chamber, off the hall, with his face unreadable, and his shoulders set like a man carrying weight he had already agreed to carry. The second flame. The champion for Beauxbaton, Fleur Delacour. The Beauxbaton girls breathed out together, something almost like a sigh. The girl who rose and walked to the door was tall and unhurried, and she glanced around the hall once before she left, as if committing it to memory. The third flame. The champion for Hogwarts, Cedric Diggory. The Hufflepuff table erupted. Fred and George made sounds of genuine pain that they rerouted into applause, and Cedric, seventh-year Quidditch captain, broadly regarded as the sort of person who was difficult to resent, walked to the chamber door with the quiet dignity of someone trying not to let his face say too much. Neville was clapping steadily beside Harry. Ron said something. Hermione began a sentence about the age line. The goblet flared. Not another submission. Something older than that. A retrieval, a reach, the goblet going down into itself and pulling something loose that had been waiting there. The fire went from blue-white to white, and for one instant burned orange at its center, a color it had not shown before, and the fourth slip of parchment that rose from it was darker at the edges than the others, slightly scorched, as if it had been held in place for a very long time. It cleared the lip of the goblet. It reached Dumbledore's hand. Harry was watching Dumbledore's face when Dumbledore looked up and said, simply, "Harry Potter." Then Harry's head split open. Not the burn, not the grinding, familiar ache from Privet Drive. summers or the sudden stab in divination, when something far away surged with hatred and sent it north like a signal. This was different and entirely new. A crack of white-hot agony at his hairline, physical, sudden, a rupture, and his vision slid sideways, and the floor came up to meet his knee before he knew he was falling, and his glasses left his face entirely. He caught himself on one hand against the cold stone. His forehead was wet. He looked at his hand. There was blood on his fingers. The hall made no sound, not a gasp, not a murmur, nothing. Every person in that room had drawn breath and was holding it, and the silence was so complete that Harry could hear the goblet's fire hissing faintly from 40 feet away. Hermione was on her feet before anything else moved. He knew it by sound, the sharp scrape of her bench when she stood too fast, and then his name in her voice, in a way he had never heard his name before. Not curiosity, not alarm, but something stripped to the wire. Ron's chair hit the floor behind him. Further down the table, Fred and George had gone completely and uncharacteristically quiet. The kind of quiet that means something is wrong in a way your mouth can't find words for yet. Hagrid rose from the staff table. You could tell him by his shadow alone, the vast, dark shape of it, rising and blocking the torchlight as he stood. He was not quick, but he was already moving, and there was something in the movement that was not panic, but lived close to it, clenched and purposeful and coming fast. From the Beauxbatons table, another figure rose. She was nearly as tall as Hagrid, and she moved with none of his urgency. Madame Maxime stood with her hands very still at her sides and looked across the hall at Harry, at the blood at his hairline, at his glasses on the floor, at the fourth charred slip still held in Dumbledore's hand, and her expression was not pity. It was something older and more considered than pity. It was recognition. Neville, without being asked, leaned across the table and placed Harry's glasses in front of him. Harry put them on. The hall resolved itself. Hundreds of faces, pale and frozen, every one of them looking at him, at the blood, at the wet print of his hand on the stone. Dumbledore was already there. He moved fast for a man who looked older than anyone Harry had ever met. He arrived and crouched, and the face looking back at Harry was white, with a fury so carefully contained that it had made itself into something very like calm. But it was not calm, and Harry was close enough to know it. Whatever Dumbledore had expected to happen in this hall tonight, it was not this. That much was certain, and Harry held on to it the way you hold on to something solid in a current. "Can you stand?" He could. He stood. The scar pulsed with every heartbeat, but his legs held, and he was grateful for small things. Snape arrived without being called. Harry heard the robes before the footsteps, the sharp, particular whisper of them cutting across the stone, and then Snape was at his other side, looking at the wound on his forehead with an expression that moved through several things quickly and settled into blankness, the kind of blankness that requires effort to maintain. "Hospital wing," Dumbledore said, very quietly, to Snape. Not a suggestion. Behind them, Professor McGonagall's voice rose clean and steady above the murmur that was starting to move through the hall. "Remain in your seats." An announcement would follow. There was no cause for alarm. She delivered all three of these statements in the tone of someone who had not decided whether they were true, but who understood that the alternative was worse. Harry let himself be guided toward the door. He did not hear what Madame Maxime said until Ron told him, much later that night. She had not followed. She had remained standing at the Beauxbatons table, very still, and she had spoken first to Karkaroff in a low voice, and then she had turned and addressed the room, the hall, the burning goblet, whatever authority she imagined was listening, and what she said was this: that dark magic had touched the selection, that the Triwizard Tournament was an initiative of the International Confederation of Wizards, the body that had founded it, and she was invoking, formally, the authority of that body to suspend the tournament pending independent review. Karkaroff, Ron said, had said nothing at all. His face had been strange, not triumphant, not the expression you might expect from a man watching Hogwarts sink, but something complicated and interior, like arithmetic that wasn't resolving the way he'd assumed it would, like he had expected one kind of problem and found another entirely. In the side chamber off the Great Hall, Victor Crumb and Fleur Delacour and Cedric Diggory waited in the quiet. No announcement came. No door opened to explain the delay. The fourth champion did not join them. He was somewhere else, pressing a bandage to his forehead, and not yet knowing what it meant. The school healer worked without speaking, which Harry appreciated. She examined the wound on his forehead, with the particular attention of someone who had stopped being surprised by most things, except this. He could tell from the way she paused with her wand a few inches from his hairline, waiting for an enchantment to take hold, and when it didn't, tried a different one. The wound resisted. Not dramatically, not with any counter-magic he could feel. It simply did not close the way a wound should close. She tried twice more, then pressed a folded cloth firmly over the split and conjured a bandage that wrapped twice around his forehead. She looked at the wound once more before tying it off, with the expression of someone who had encountered a problem she intended to return to. "For the pain," she said, and gave him something in a small phial. It tasted of nettles and chalk and helped somewhat with the throbbing. He was escorted to Dumbledore's office, with the bandage still in place, and the whole right side of his face feeling tight and distant. He had never been there after midnight before, never with blood drying under cloth, and no particular idea what he was walking into. The stone staircase, the gargoyle, all of it was the same as it ever was, and entirely different. The gargoyle stood aside without being asked. The office was lit softly, not the warm lamplight of Dumbledore's usual arrangements, but something cooler and more formal. The portraits of past headmasters were awake and very still. Fawkes looked at Harry from his perch in the corner, with the calm attention of a creature who has witnessed considerably worse. The room was full of people. Dumbledore stood behind his desk. He had not sat down, and Harry had the impression he had not sat since the Great Hall. Snape was at the far wall near the window, arms at his sides, his face arranged in the expression that meant he was thinking faster than he was showing. Professor McGonagall stood near the door and looked at Harry when he came in, with the particular look she reserved for situations she considered fundamentally unacceptable. Percy stood to one side, holding a quill and a piece of parchment, performing competence with the dedication of a man who had not eaten since morning and did not intend to mention it. On the other side of the room stood Bartemius Crouch, thin and exact, his expression giving away nothing, and beside him in the other chair was Ludo Bagman, whose normally cheerful face had acquired a strained quality, as if someone had turned his good chair inside out with steady pressure. Madame Maxime stood between the fireplace and the bookcase. She was taller than everyone else in the room, and had the quality of someone who had decided exactly what she intended to say, and was waiting for the right moment. Karkaroff was nearest the centre. He had been pacing in a small radius. When Harry came in, he stopped and looked at Harry with an expression Harry couldn't name, not hostile, but internal and complicated, like a man whose equation had changed terms without warning. Moody arrived shortly after. He came in with his wooden leg and his scarred face, and his magical eye turning a slow arc around the room, cataloguing everything at once. He positioned himself beside Snape near the window, and said nothing. Harry sat in the chair that had been left, conspicuously, in the centre of all of them. "Harry," Dumbledore said. "Did you put your name in the goblet of fire?" "No," Harry said. "Did you ask an older student to do it for you?" "No." "Do you have any knowledge of how your name came to be in the goblet?" "No." Dumbledore looked at him for a moment. "I believe you," he said, plainly, as if it were simply a thing that was true, and then turned to the room. Karkaroff drew breath. Maxime shifted her weight. Dumbledore did not raise his voice. The question of how Harry's name entered the goblet is separate from the question of what is to be done now that it has. Mr. Crouch. Bartemius Crouch looked at Harry with the steady attention of a man working through a legal problem rather than looking at a boy. "The placing of your name in the goblet of fire constitutes a binding magical contract," he said. "There can be no change of heart once you have become a champion." "He is 14, McGonagall said. "He is a champion. The goblet is an impartial magical artifact. It does not select on the basis of age. The contract is binding." "Then find a mechanism to unbind it," McGonagall said. Crouch and Bagman exchanged a look, not the look of men who had found a mechanism and were considering it, but the look of men who had been searching and had come up short. Moody spoke for the first time. He had been watching the room, but now he addressed Dumbledore with the measured weight of a man accustomed to taking the darkest reading and having it prove correct. "Someone put that boy's name in the goblet, knowing he would be bound to compete. Knowing what these tasks can do to someone who is 14, and not remotely in the same category as the other 3. He let that settle. "Whoever did it wants him inside those tasks. The contract isn't a mistake. It's the mechanism." The room absorbed this. Karkaroff said nothing, but something shifted in his face. A settling, a recalculation. Bagman looked at the wall. Percy's quill had stopped moving. Maxime moved, not aggressively. She simply repositioned from beside the bookcase to nearer the center, and the movement changed the geometry of the room without displacing anyone. When she spoke, her accent sharpened each phrase with a precise, deliberate weight. "The child is 14. The minimum age was set at 17. The goblet was placed under an age line." She looked at Dumbledore. "Your age line, Headmaster, which was bypassed, and when the 4th name emerged, this child bled from a wound that does not respond to standard healing." The pause she left was not theatrical. It was simply the space required for what she had said to land. The Triwizard Tournament is a founding initiative of the International Confederation of Wizards. I am formally invoking the authority of that body to suspend this tournament, pending independent investigation of how this selection occurred. The portraits stirred in their frames. Dumbledore removed his half-moon spectacles. He set them on the desk and looked at them for a long moment before he looked back at the room. "You are correct, Madame Maxime, that this requires the ICW's oversight." He folded his hands on the desk. "You have been generous enough not to state the obvious corollary. I will state it. I am Supreme Mugwump of the International Confederation of Wizards. I cannot chair an investigation into the conduct of my own school. I will not act in that capacity in this matter." He met Maxime's eyes steadily. "I am recusing myself from all official ICW proceedings here. From this moment, I act only as Hogwarts headmaster. Independent oversight belongs to someone without my conflict of interest." Karkaroff went very still. McGonagall's chin came up slightly. Percy's quill remained where it had stopped. Harry's scar was not rupturing. It was radiating a low, steady heat under the bandage. Nothing to do with the healer's salve. He pressed 2 fingers against the cloth, not to check it, but simply to confirm the pressure was real. The heat pulsed slowly and did not intensify. Something far away was paying attention to whatever was happening in this room. He couldn't have said how he knew that. Snape had not spoken since Harry arrived. He had not moved from the wall beside the window, and he was watching moody with an expression of concentrated neutrality, not disinterest, but the specific quality Harry had learned over 4 years to distinguish from ordinary attention. It was the attention of a man cataloguing discrepancies, waiting for a pattern to resolve. Moody had named the mechanism, the contract as a tool, not an error, before any other person in the room had framed the theory. He had done it cleanly, without hesitation, as if the shape of it had been clear to him from the start. Moody did not look at Snape. The magical eye did, just once, briefly, a sweep across the wall toward the window before it moved away again. Snape said nothing. He kept his eyes on the room, his left hand, inside his sleeve, pressed once against his forearm, and was still. Dumbledore waited until the hall was fully occupied before he spoke. Ron had been halfway through a piece of toast when he felt the silence drop, the particular silence that meant Dumbledore had risen at the staff table, and the sound of 600 students eating and talking and being 600 students simply stopped, the way it always stopped, without command. He set down his toast. "I have a brief announcement," Dumbledore said. His voice carried without amplification, which was something Ron had never quite gotten used to. "The Triwizard Tournament has been suspended, pending an inquiry by the International Confederation of Wizards into the method of champion selection. No tasks will take place during this period. I will communicate further developments as they arise." He sat down. For a moment, maybe 3 seconds, the hall held itself completely still. Then the sound came back in at roughly twice the volume it had left. Ron turned to his left. Harry was sitting beside him with his toast untouched, and his hands in his lap, and a bandage still on his forehead. And he was not looking at Dumbledore anymore. He was looking at the table. Across the hall, the reactions were readable from where Ron sat, if you paid attention. At the Hufflepuff table, Cedric Diggory had gone very still. He was a 7th year who had earned his selection honestly. Everyone knew it. And whatever he felt about the suspension, it didn't surface on his face as anything simple. He sat with his elbows on the table for a moment, then straightened and turned to say something quietly to the Hufflepuff beside him. Ron couldn't see his expression. Something in his posture said he was being careful with it. The Durmstrang group were harder to read. Their champion, Victor Krum, had been doing the same thing he always seemed to be doing, which was sitting in the general vicinity of everyone else while radiating the particular quality of someone who is present but not available. He did not visibly react when Dumbledore spoke. He simply stopped eating and sat looking at nothing with his heavy brows low, and then began eating again a moment later. Across the hall, the Beauxbatons students moved differently. They murmured to each other in rapid French. Their champion sat among them and looked not at the staff table but at the door, as if calculating something about the distance to it. Fred said something under his breath. Ron caught the word wages. George turned to Fred with an expression Ron had seen exactly once before at Bill's graduation when the cake had fallen, a face performing absolute neutrality to hide something much more specific underneath it. "How many?" George said quietly. "All of them," Fred said. George nodded once, then looked at the table. He did not say anything else. Neither of them reached for their food. After a moment, Fred picked up his pumpkin juice, looked at it, and set it back down. It was the absence of the joke that unsettled Ron most. Fred and George without the joke were something different and harder to name. Ron looked back at Harry. In another version of this, the version Ron had imagined in the 30 seconds between Harry's name coming out of the goblet and the scar rupturing, Harry might have been a champion right now, There might have been the part of it that Ron didn't like to examine too closely. The envy, clean and small but real. The way it would have felt to watch his name not be called when Harry's was, again, because that was apparently how things went. He knew the feeling was petty. He'd have felt it anyway, but Harry wasn't a champion. Harry was sitting beside him with a bandage on his head that contained a wound the school healer couldn't close, and the tournament was suspended, and none of it had happened the way the imaginary version would have gone. What Ron felt looking at him now was nothing like envy. It was something more like the particular uneasiness of standing close to a lightning rod in open weather. "You all right?" Ron said. "Yeah," Harry said. Neither of them was convinced by this, and neither of them said so. Percy arrived mid-morning. Ron saw him from across the entrance hall, cutting through the flow of students between classes with the particular momentum of a person on a specific errand, and for a moment thought he was coming to find them. But Percy's path cut toward the stone staircase and upward, toward the headmaster's tower, with a sealed letter in his hand and the expression of someone carrying out a task they had assigned too much personal significance. He looked exhausted. Not in the way you looked exhausted after a late night, but in the way you looked exhausted after several things you'd expected to make sense had stopped making sense, and you were still waiting for the part where they resolved. His collar was perfect. His badge was straight. Ron watched him go up the stairs and didn't say anything about it to anyone. At breakfast the next morning, Neville sat down beside Harry without preamble. He had arrived before either of them, something he almost never did, and had already poured his own pumpkin juice. He handed the toast rack to Harry when Harry sat down. Harry took a piece. Neville turned back to his own plate. No mention of the tournament. No mention of the bandage, which was smaller now, the school healer having replaced it twice. No mention of the previous night, or anything else, requiring a response. "Marmalade?" Neville said, already holding it out. "Cheers," Harry said. They ate breakfast. That evening Ron heard Ginny before he saw her. He was coming down the corridor from the library, and she was at the far end, standing near the tapestry with 2 third-year girls, and her voice had the particular flat quality it got when she had made up her mind about something. "Put a 14-year-old's name in a tournament with tasks that have killed people," she was saying, "and then act offended because someone noticed. He didn't ask for it, he didn't want it. Anyone who thinks he put his name in should take a closer look at what a scar looks like when it splits." Ron had stopped walking to hear this. Harry, who had come round the corner half a step behind him, had stopped too. He didn't make a sound. Ginny didn't turn around. She went on talking, and the third years were nodding carefully with the expressions of people filing the information away for later, and Harry stood very still in the corridor and didn't interrupt. Eventually they walked past. Ginny noticed them only as they cleared the tapestry and looked up, a fraction of a second of recognition, and then looked deliberately back at the third years and kept talking. Harry said nothing. He walked with his head down the rest of the way to the common room. Late that night, when the fire in the Gryffindor common room had burned down to embers and everyone else had gone to bed, Harry sat in the armchair nearest the heat and looked at a blank piece of parchment. He had been there for a while, long enough that the fire had gone from flame to glow, and the orange light it threw across the hearthrug had gone from amber to something closer to red. He had the parchment and his quill, and the ink was open, and he had written nothing. He had been trying to think of how to start the letter to Sirius. The scar was quiet. It had been quiet all day. The low, steady heat that had settled in since the night of the selection, just enough to remind him it was there, not enough to mean anything immediate. Quiet was not the same as gone. Quiet was not the same as safe. The tournament was suspended, and he was not competing, and everything was, on the surface, resolved in exactly the way he would have wanted it resolved. He still felt watched. Not here. Not in this room. Something at a distance, patient, aware that this was not over. He didn't know how to put that in a letter without sounding as if he were inventing it, and he didn't know how to write to Sirius without explaining why he was writing, and he didn't know where to begin. He picked up the quill. He set it down again. The fire shifted and settled, and gave off less heat than before. Side of the castle with a better line of sight than Harry's. The man who had been stunned beside the lake was not the man they had all looked at for the past 4 months. Or rather, he was. And then the polyjuice wore off, because without a constant fresh dose of it, there was nothing to maintain the transformation, and what was underneath was not the scarred and grizzled face of Alastair Moody at all. What was underneath was younger and thinner, and had the specific look of someone whose face had been compressed by years of concealment into a kind of intensity that had nowhere left to go. His name, as the investigators confirmed it by late afternoon, was Bartemius Crouch, Jr. He had been, in the world outside Hogwarts, a convicted Death Eater, and a man sent to Azkaban for crimes whose specifics the investigators did not share at that stage. He was now in ministry custody, transferred out of Hogwarts in the early evening by 2 officials in dark robes, who arrived by portkey on the grounds and did not speak to anyone at the school. Percy was in the headmaster's tower for most of the afternoon. He came down at supper with the particular expression of a man who had been thorough about something he had not enjoyed being thorough about, and who was going to need a considerable amount of time before he would be willing to discuss how he felt about any of it. Hermione sat across from Harry at the Gryffindor table and ate her supper without tasting it. The reasoning had been right. The eye that saw through walls, the operational precision of the testimony, the set of capabilities that matched in only one direction. She had been right. The real Alastair Moody was in the hospital wing, recovering from months in a trunk. The man who had sat across from the investigators and described the saboteurs' methods with the fluency of someone describing their own work was in ministry custody 20 miles south. Harry ate his supper and said almost nothing and looked at the table. His scar was quiet. It had been quiet all day. She did not know what that meant, except that whatever the scar was tracking was not in this castle anymore, and the plan it had been executing had just lost the person it needed here. "You were right," Harry said quietly at the end of supper, when they were the last 2 at the table. "I know," Hermione said. She pushed her plate away. "I really wanted to be wrong." They brought him into Dumbledore's office at 9 in the morning, and Harry, seated in the chair that had become familiar to him, the one in the middle, the one that felt like being inside a compass, watched the door, and watched the man who came through it, and tried to reconcile the face with the months that had preceded it. He didn't look like himself. Or rather, he looked like what was underneath what Harry had spent 4 months looking at. And the underneath was younger and thinner and more angular, and had the quality of someone wrung out not by years, but by the specific effort of sustained concealment. His hands were bound. His eyes were moving in the way that eyes moved when the mind behind them was still making assessments, and the rest of the situation was not under its control. Dumbledore was present as headmaster, as he had been at every formal stage of this process, in the capacity he had designated and not exceeded. The 2 ICW investigators stood near the window with their quills and their parchment. Snape was at the far wall. McGonagall sat nearest the door. Harry had not been sure whether he would be allowed in the room until Dumbledore had looked at him across the corridor outside and said very quietly that he thought Harry had a right to hear it. The Veritaserum was administered in 3 drops from a small crystal phial, colourless, odourless, the consistency of water, 3 drops on the tongue. Dumbledore tilted the phial himself and did it without ceremony. There was a brief silence, and then the man in the chair changed quality. Not expression, not posture, but something more interior, a relaxation of the mechanism behind the eyes that happened between one breath and the next. "Your name," the lead investigator said. "Bartimius Crouch, Jr.," he said. His voice had gone flat, not frightened, not resistant, simply literal, answering the question that had been asked. They took it through the procedure. Each question, each answer, in the same flat, literal register. Yes, he had placed Harry Potter's name in the Goblet of Fire. He had used a confundus charm on the goblet selection mechanism, worked into it in the 3 nights before the submission window opened, alone, after hours, in the entrance hall. He had known the goblet's internal structure from prior study. He had checked the charm was holding each subsequent night from outside the hall, using an eye that saw through walls until the selection took place. He had done it on the orders of Lord Voldemort. The plan was as follows. Harry Potter enters the tournament. Harry Potter wins the tournament, or is present at the final task. The tournament trophy is a port key, prepared in advance. It transports Harry to a graveyard at Little Hangleton, Yorkshire. There, the ritual requires a bone from the father's grave, flesh willingly given by a servant, and blood of an enemy. Harry's blood. The ritual restores Lord Voldemort to full bodily form. Harry heard all of this and said nothing. He looked at the man in the chair and listened. He knew, in a way that was difficult to hold as a complete thought, that this described something that had been averted by a scar rupturing at a specific moment, that in another version of events, a graveyard in Yorkshire was where he had been intended to end up. His blood in a cauldron. A man who had wanted him dead since he was a year old. His scar was quiet. Yes, Bartimius Crouch Sr., the tournament's administrator, had been under the imperious curse, applied by his son. He had been controlled throughout the period of his appointment to the tournament's oversight. His correspondence had been intercepted and managed. His public communications had been generated by the son, not the father. The flat literal register did not change for any of it. When it was over, when the investigators had their record and the session was concluded, Dumbledore thanked Harry for being present and told him he could leave. Harry left. He walked down the stone stairs of the headmaster's tower and stood in the corridor for a moment, with his back against the stone wall. The trophy had been a trap. Everything in the tournament had been constructed to ensure he survived long enough to touch it. He filed this, the way you filed a thing too large to think about all at once, and went to class. The formal ruling came the following afternoon. The ICW investigators, with the confession in record and the confundus evidence confirmed, issued their finding on the binding contract. Their position was precise, and, Hermione told Harry later, legally significant. No individual wizard could void a magical contract. The magic was independent of individual authority. But the ICW was not an individual wizard. It was the institutional founding body of the tournament itself, which meant it was the entity that had created the magical framework governing the competition. A contract formed through deliberate corruption of an artifact that body had sanctioned could be ruled void by that body's authority. No individual voiding. An institutional ruling on whether the contract had been validly formed at all. It had not. The contract was void. Harry sat in the common room that evening and read the letter Hermione had given him, summarizing the legal basis of the ruling, and then he sat for a while looking at the fire. In Dumbledore's office during the session, Snape had not moved and not changed expression when Crouch Jr. named the blood ritual and Voldemort's plan. The mark burned throughout, not at the elevated baseline, but higher, a specific surge he recognized. Voldemort's fury at the plan's collapse, registering across the mark's network, reporting to every Death Eater at once, without distinction. What Snape calculated, his face giving away nothing. Voldemort would not slow down. A failed plan was a redirected plan. The danger had changed shape again. 2 days after the Veritaserum session, Harry visited the hospital wing. The real Alastor Moody was in the corner bed, propped slightly upright, and looked like a man assembled from the record of a difficult career. Without the magical eye, which had been property taken by the impostor and was now in an evidence case at the ministry, the left side of his face showed the scar tissue that had been there before the eye. Without the wooden leg, his frame under the blanket was asymmetric and looked heavier in ways that had nothing to do with weight. He was connected to monitoring charms by 3 gold filaments that ran from his wrist to a bracket on the headboard. The school healer had told Harry he could have 5 minutes. He looked at Harry for a moment without speaking. His remaining eye was blue-grey and had the particular quality of a man who had been looking at difficult things for long enough that the looking itself had become part of his face. "Heard you found me," he said. His voice was rough from months of disuse, but it had its own timbre underneath that, a flatness that was not unfriendly, a gravel that came from somewhere below theatrics. Heard the girl reasoned it out first. "She did," Harry said. Moody was quiet for a moment. He looked at the ceiling. "She's right to be careful who she tells things to," he said. "Not praise exactly, more like endorsement of a habit. In general, as a practice." Harry nodded. "You're all right?" Moody said. He said it in the tone of a man doing a functional check, not seeking an emotional answer. "Yeah," Harry said. "Good," Moody said. He closed his eye, which was apparently the end of the visit. Harry left him there. Percy did not attend the Veritaserum session, which was closed to staff, except those specifically required. He received the findings the same way most of the school did, in summary through official channels, and he processed one specific fact in the particular way that Percy processed things he had not prepared himself for. Alone, very thoroughly, over a long period of time. The fact was that the man he had been proud to work for had spent the past several months as his own son's instrument. The correspondence Percy had been carrying, the statements he had been delivering, the administrative competence he had been trying to emulate, all of it had been generated or managed by the person who had imprisoned the man in the 7th compartment of a trunk. Percy was 18. He sat with it in the way of someone who had put trust in something that turned out to be a mechanism, and who did not yet know what to do with the trust now that the mechanism was exposed. He kept it anyway, because it was the only part of any of it that was still his. He was not asleep. That was the first thing he would say later, when people asked, and it was the most important thing. He had been awake for half an hour, sitting in the armchair nearest the window in the Gryffindor common room at some point past 2 in the morning, not reading, not thinking about anything in particular, simply awake in the way he had been awake a lot lately. The scar at its ambient temperature, the castle around him doing the things a very old building did in the night, and the window showing him a dark sky over darker grounds. Then the scar got worse. Not the rupture, it was a third state, higher than the elevated baseline that had settled in since October, lower than what had happened at the selection night, but close enough that he pressed the back of his hand against his forehead and felt the heat radiating outward, and thought, very carefully, about whether to go to Dumbledore. He was sitting with that thought when he heard it. Through the glass. Outside, somewhere on the grounds, in the dark where he could see nothing. A sound that was not English, and not any language he had words for, and that he understood without wanting to, with the immediate involuntary comprehension that Parseltongue worked on him, a directional sound, a moving sound, something that was going somewhere with a specific purpose, and was aware, in the slow and certain way of cold-blooded things, of the warmth it was moving toward. He could not see the source. The grounds were dark and empty, as far as the window showed him. He did not go to Dumbledore. The headmaster's tower was across the castle. The dungeon was below. He went to Snape. He had not thought carefully about this. Only closer. And Snape has the mark. He went down 2 staircases, in his socks, and without his glasses, the castle cold and dark around him, and knocked on the dungeon door that had a thin line of candlelight visible underneath it. Snape opened it quickly, which meant he had been near it. He was fully dressed. His left forearm was against his side, held slightly away from his body, the way a person held a limb that was causing them pain they did not intend to display. "The scar," Harry said. "Parseltongue." "I heard something outside." His voice came out low and steady, which he was faintly proud of. "On the grounds." Snape's face did not move. His eyes moved. A brief, assessing pass that took in Harry's face and the hand against his forehead and the absence of glasses. "Yes," Snape said. "The mark is burning." He stepped back from the doorway and went to his desk and wrote something on a piece of parchment in a very fast hand, and sealed it with a charm, and sent it with a small owl that appeared from a box on the shelf with the practiced air of an owl accustomed to being needed at odd hours. Then he turned back to Harry with the expression he wore when he was making a calculation, and the answer was not comfortable. "Sit down," he said, which was not an invitation he had ever extended before. Harry sat in the single chair that faced the desk. Snape remained standing, and they waited. Hagrid arrived at the edge of the grounds 20 minutes after the message reached him. How long it took him after that to check what needed checking was something Harry did not directly observe, but the elapsed time when Hagrid knocked at the dungeon door was a little over an hour. He was carrying a lantern and had his crossbow over one shoulder, and he looked like a man returning from a task he would have preferred to find nothing on, and had not found nothing on. "Trail in the outer forest," he said, to both of them. He had a look in his eyes that Harry recognized as the look Hagrid got when something had been upsetting, and he was deciding how much of the upset to pass on. Scales caught on the bark, big scales from something large, crushed undergrowth in a path that went along the perimeter and then turned back. It didn't come onto the grounds proper. Stopped at the tree line. He paused. "Hagrid's lands don't include the outer forest, but I know where the enchantments start. It didn't cross them." "Thank you, Hagrid," Snape said. His voice was measured and quiet, which was its own kind of significant. "Please don't mention this to anyone tonight. We'll go up." They went to Dumbledore, all 4 of them, at 3 in the morning, Harry in socks and without his glasses. The stone stairs, the gargoyle, the office lit at an hour when it should have been dark, which told Harry that Dumbledore had been awake too, waiting for something he had been expecting might come. He listened to Hagrid's report. He listened to Harry's account of the Parseltongue and the scar. He did not express alarm, which was either reassuring or the opposite of reassuring, depending on how much you trusted a man not to minimize things. And Harry had, by now, significant evidence that Dumbledore did not minimize things. He simply processed them at a depth that looked like calm. "Thank you, Hagrid," he said. "Please go to bed. I'll speak with you in the morning." Hagrid went. Dumbledore looked at Snape. "The enchantment's on the outer boundary," he said. Not a question. "I'll review them with Flitwick tomorrow," Snape said. "Tonight," Dumbledore said, still without urgency. "If you don't mind." Snape left. Dumbledore turned to Harry with the specific quality of attention he used when he was about to be honest rather than diplomatic. "You did the right thing," he said, "both in coming to Professor Snape and in being accurate about what you heard. The fact that you understand Parseltongue does not make you responsible for what it is used to say." Harry nodded. "He didn't accept the failure," Dumbledore said. He was not talking to Harry anymore exactly, more to something beyond the office window, the dark grounds, the direction of the forest. Then he looked back. "We knew he wouldn't. This is still containable. I need you to go to the hospital wing." He said it in the tone of a man for whom hospital wing and still containable belonged in the same sentence, which was a tone Harry had not encountered before and didn't enjoy. The school healer gave him something in a phial. "A calming draught," she said, "not for the scar, but for the physical after-effects of the sustained pain, the way muscles locked and released when something had been burning for a long time." It helped. He lay back against the pillow and let it help. In the adjacent bed, Alastair Moody, the real one, still recovering, thinner than he had looked when Harry first visited, and somehow also more solid now that a month of the school healer's work had begun to have its effect, was awake. He had been awake, probably, since the alarm that had moved through the castle. He was watching Harry from across the ward with his remaining eye, which had a quality of close and unsentimental attention that Harry had, for 4 months, seen copied by someone else, and which was different in the original in ways he couldn't immediately name. "You understand it," Moody said. His voice was rough and had its own register, not theatrical, not designed. "The snake's language." "Yes," Harry said, "but you didn't go find out what it was saying in person." "No." Moody was quiet for a moment, looking at the ceiling with the expression of a man reviewing a checklist. "Surviving something you were not supposed to survive," he said. Not as if he were delivering a lesson, but as if he were simply stating what he had observed across a long career. "Teaches you something most people don't get to learn. You're learning it earlier than most." He paused. "That's not a good thing, but it's what you've got." Harry looked at him. He thought about the 4 months of performance he had watched in that face, reproduced well enough to fool everyone who should have known better. The original, depleted and without the borrowed parts of himself, was different only because it was real. "Right," Harry said. "Thanks." "Sleep," Moody said. He turned over, an effortful process with the missing leg, and faced the wall. Outside the hospital wing, on the stone bench in the corridor, 3 people who had been there for the past 40 minutes and were not going anywhere were doing the following. Ron Weasley was sitting with his arms folded and his jaw set and the expression of a person who was ready to be angry at whoever most required it. Hermione Granger had a book open on her lap that she was not reading, and Neville Longbottom, who had been the one to notice Harry leave the dormitory without his glasses, was sitting at the end of the bench with the glasses in his hand, waiting for someone to let him in so he could return them. No one let them in. They were still there at 4 in the morning, which is when the school healer checked the corridor and told them firmly to go to bed. And they did, because there was nothing left to wait for that the night would provide. They came back at breakfast. The ICW's formal ruling arrived in March, announced at breakfast on a Tuesday, with a plainness that seemed almost inadequate to what it contained. The Triwizard Tournament was cancelled. No tasks would take place. No prize would be awarded. No champion would be named. The 3 selected champions were released from all obligations, magical and otherwise. The students of Beauxbatons and Durmstrang would complete their academic term as guests of Hogwarts and return home at the year's end. Dumbledore read the ruling summary to the assembled school in the same tone he used for administrative notices. He thanked everyone for their patience and forbearance. He sat down. That was all. At the Hufflepuff table, Cedric Diggory looked at his plate for a moment, and then reached for the toast. At the Ravenclaw table, where the Durmstrang students had migrated over the months in the way that people living temporarily somewhere eventually stopped sitting at the edge of it, Victor Crumb received the news in the way he received most things, with a stillness that said he had already considered the possibility. He ate his breakfast. At the Beauxbatons table, Fleur Delacour turned to the girl beside her and said something in French, quickly, that Harry couldn't hear from where he was sitting. He didn't try to. He reached for the marmalade. The spring came to Hogwarts in the particular way it always came, unreliably, in fits, 3 warm days followed by a week of sleet, and the school absorbed the changed circumstance of the tournament's cancellation the way it absorbed most things, slowly, and then all at once, and then as if it had always been that way. Classes continued, the library continued, the grounds dried out enough by late April that students were eating lunch outside again, sitting on the banks above the lake. He saw Hagrid and Maxime on the grounds the morning before the Beauxbatons carriage was due to leave. He was coming out of the entrance hall when he saw them, down near the edge of the pumpkin patch, 2 enormous figures standing close enough to be in conversation, and far enough from the castle that the conversation was entirely private. Hagrid had his hands in his coat pockets. Maxime had her arms folded against the May morning chill. They were not arguing. They were talking in the low, unhurried way of people who have found that what they have in common is larger than what they had expected to find, and who are making use of the time remaining to establish this properly. Harry did not interrupt. He went back inside and let them have it. Karkaroff left without ceremony, which seemed right for a man who had arrived without it. Harry saw the Durmstrang ship from the first-floor window as it cleared the surface of the Black Lake and moved away into the late afternoon water. He could not see Karkaroff from this distance. He knew what the man had been carrying for the past several months. The dark mark, burning at its elevated baseline, the confirmation of Voldemort's involvement in the tampering that the ICW's investigation had placed into formal record. He knew what that confirmation meant for a man who had once served Voldemort and had bought his way out of Azkaban by naming names. He watched the ship move away toward the horizon and did not feel whatever he might have expected to feel. The ship went out of sight. The lake was very still afterward. "He's still out there," Hermione said. She said it to Harry 2 days after the delegations had left, in the Gryffindor common room, without preamble, in the tone she used when she had been thinking about something long enough that it had stopped being possible not to say it. Voldemort. Still at the Riddle House, still strengthening, still adapting his plans. The tournament being stopped didn't stop any of that. The question was never who stopped the tournament. She looked at him. The question is what he does next. "I know," Harry said. She looked at him for a moment, as if checking whether he was saying it to end the conversation, or because it was true. He met her eyes. She nodded once and went back to her book. Ron turned 15 in March. He was the same person, slightly taller, and had been the person sitting on the end of Harry's bed at 2 in the morning in November, and had been the person with his arms folded outside the hospital wing, and had been the person who said, "I never thought you put your name in," as if it were simply a thing that was true and required saying. He asked Harry, standing on the platform at King's Cross before the train, "Ready to go home?" He didn't mean Privet Drive. Harry didn't correct him. Fred and George turned 17 in April, which meant that somewhere in the intervening period between the selection night and the last day of term, they had crossed the threshold that the age line had been built to protect, and were now, technically, old enough to have entered the tournament on their own. Neither of them mentioned this. At the last feast, they were quieter than Harry had ever seen them at a feast, quieter than seemed natural for two people who treated every meal as an occasion for something. They ate their food and watched the hall and exchanged no visible looks, which was the most unusual thing about them. That evening, George put a dung bomb in Percy's trunk. Harry heard about it from Ginny, who had found out from Fred, who had found out by being the other twin. Percy had found the dung bomb when he was packing. He had held it for a moment. Ginny did not know how long, only that there had been a pause, and then he had set it aside on top of his folded robes and continued packing. He had not said a word about it to anyone. Harry thought about that for a while, and then decided it was the most accurate thing anyone had done all year. At the last feast, Neville sat beside him and ate through the soup and the roast and the pudding without requiring conversation, which was one of the things Harry had come to appreciate about Neville, that his company was not conditional on being engaged with it. As they were pushing back their chairs, Neville said, "Next year's going to be a normal year." He said it with the confidence of a person who had decided this was true and was not entertaining counter-arguments. "Yeah," Harry said. He hoped so. He did not know. Snape was at the top of the dungeon stairs as the students moved toward the carriages on the last morning. Harry saw him in the way. You saw a detail that wasn't moving when everything else was. The black robes, the composed stillness, watching the flow of students going toward the exit with the particular attention of a man noting who was leaving and in what condition. As Harry passed the staircase, Snape's eyes did not move to him. He watched the corridor. Harry watched him for a moment from the corner of his eye. He saw Snape reach across with his right hand and, very briefly, run it along the inside of his left sleeve, as if checking the temperature of something he had grown too accustomed to ever stop monitoring. He let the sleeve fall. He continued watching the corridor. Harry went outside. On the Hogwarts Express, he found a compartment near the back with Ron and Hermione and Neville, and they played Exploding Snap for 2 hours while the castle receded behind them, and no one mentioned the tournament. By the time the landscape outside the window had changed from Scottish hills to something flatter and more recognizable, the card game was finished, and Ron and Neville were sleeping, and Hermione was reading, and Harry was at the window. The Black Lake was long behind them. The Durmstrang ship was gone. The Beauxbatons carriage was gone. The lake had gone back to being a lake, the grounds to being grounds. The year had contracted to something the size of the train compartment around him and the unchanging sound of the engine. He pressed 2 fingers to the scar above his hairline. The skin there had healed over mostly. The wound that the school healer's spells had never quite closed, finally closing on its own timeline, in its own way. The scar was quiet. The heat was at its baseline. The same low ambient temperature that had been his constant companion since October 31st. The temperature he had learned to live beside. It would not stay quiet. He knew that with the same certainty that he knew the train would eventually stop. But the compartment was warm, and his friends were in it. And right now the scar was quiet, and he pressed his fingers against it once more, just to feel that it was real, that the skin was real, that all of it had happened, and he was still here to remember it. And then he let his hand fall, and he watched the window, and the train carried him forward into whatever came next.